Right now, beneath the ground in Texas and Louisiana, there are more than 400 million barrels of crude oil sitting in silence underground. Not in tanks, not in warehouses, underground, dissolved into massive caverns carved out of ancient salt. And that's just one country. Every major nation on Earth has its own system for hiding, holding, and protecting its oil. Because oil isn't just fuel, it's leverage, it's survival. It keeps economies running when the world goes wrong. Here is every way countries store oil, from underground caverns to floating tankers to tunnels inside mountains. Salt caverns, tank farms, floating tankers, rock tunnels, pipelines, and rail cars. Each one is a different answer to the same question. Every method is a different answer to the same question. What happens when the oil stops coming? The wrong answer to that question has toppled governments, crashed economies, and sent countries to war. No jargon, no politics. Just every method explained, clearly and completely. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how the world holds on to the fuel that powers everything. A strategic petroleum reserve is a government-controlled stockpile of oil held specifically for emergencies. Not for daily use, not for profit. For the moment a war starts, a hurricane hits, or a foreign power cuts off supply. The US Reserve alone has an authorized capacity of 714 million barrels, enough crude to fill roughly 560 million cars once refined. The entire system sits underground, run by the federal government, and can begin releasing oil within 13 days of a presidential order. The reserve was created in 1975, after the 1973 oil embargo showed exactly how completely a foreign supply cut could cripple the US economy. One embargo. Fuel shortages across the country. Lines stretching around gas stations. That experience built the reserve. The reserve exists so that experience never has to happen again. It is not an energy policy, it is an insurance policy. A strategic petroleum reserve only matters when everything else has already gone wrong. Countries like the United States, China, India, Japan, and South Korea all maintain strategic petroleum reserves. It sits in silence, underground. It waits. And when the moment comes, it's the last line of defense for the entire economy. 13 days from a presidential order to oil flowing into the market. In a crisis, that speed is everything. So where exactly does all this oil go? The answer begins 2,000 feet underground, in salt. Salt cavern storage, the most efficient method of holding large volumes of crude oil underground, and it starts with water. The process begins by drilling into a deep salt formation and pumping fresh water down into it. The water dissolves the salt from the inside out, gradually hollowing the rock into a sealed underground chamber. Each finished cavern can reach 200 feet wide and more than 2,500 feet deep. That is enormous scale. The Willis Tower in Chicago could fit inside one of these caverns, with room to spare above it. The cavern walls form a near-perfect natural seal. Salt doesn't corrode. It doesn't crack. It flexes under stress and reseals itself. Oil stored inside stays clean and contained for decades, without significant maintenance required. Pumping oil out is done by injecting brine back in, which pushes the crude upward under natural pressure. The US uses 60 of these caverns. Germany, China, and India use similar formations where the geology allows. The caverns aren't visible from the surface, aren't vulnerable to weather, and are nearly impossible to destroy. Salt cavern storage works because nature already built the container. Engineers just created the space inside it. Compared to any above-ground option, salt caverns win on safety, invisibility, and long-term cost. The trade-off is geology. Not every country has the salt. But the part of oil storage that most people actually see, that's above the ground entirely. And tank farms are exactly what they sound like. Large clusters of cylindrical steel tanks holding crude oil and refined products. Every oil-producing and oil-importing country uses them. Saudi Arabia, Singapore, the Netherlands, and the US all operate major tank farms. Each tank can hold hundreds of thousands of barrels, A full tank farm holds millions. They are the most visible part of the global fuel supply chain. Oil arrives and leaves them in massive volumes every day. That visibility is also their weakness. They're exposed to weather, fire risk, and in conflict zones, deliberate attack. A single rupture or fire at a large tank farm can disrupt regional fuel supplies for weeks. Hay remain essential because they are flexible. When demand shifts, a tank farm can be expanded relatively quickly. Underground caverns cannot. The world runs on oil you can't see, but the part you can see is still doing most of the work. But what happens when the land tanks are full and prices are still falling? The oil moves offshore. Floating storage. When land tanks are full and prices are falling, oil doesn't disappear. It waits offshore. Floating storage means anchoring oil tankers at sea, keeping their cargo on board and waiting for a better moment to sell. Singapore, the UAE, and Malaysia use this regularly. During major disruptions, dozens of tankers sit idle in the same stretch of ocean. When the price of oil today is lower than the expected price in 6 months, storing oil at sea and selling it later becomes profitable. The cost of chartering a tanker gets offset by the price difference at sale. The ocean becomes a warehouse. When too many tankers are parked offshore, markets know supply is being withheld. Prices shift in response. The decision of when to sail becomes a financial one, not a logistical one. Timing the market from the open ocean. Float. Wait. Sell at the right moment. Floating storage turns patience into profit. Floating storage turns the ocean into a warehouse, and it influences global oil prices more than most people ever realize. Some countries take a different approach entirely and bury their oil not in salt, but inside solid rock. Underground rock cavern storage. Not every country sits on usable salt deposits, so some drill into solid bedrock instead. These caverns are excavated by drilling and blasting deep into stable geological formations, then reinforced with concrete and steel. Norway, Sweden, Finland, South Korea, and Japan all store oil in caverns manually carved into solid rock. The result is a facility that can withstand extreme weather, earthquakes, and, in theory, military strikes. For countries with genuine security concerns, burying their oil supply inside a mountain is not excessive. It is practical. Rock cavern storage costs more to build than salt caverns and cannot be easily expanded once constructed. But for the nations that use it, the protection it provides is worth every dollar of investment. Salt caverns where geology allows, rock caverns where security demands it. Both solutions to the same problem. Some countries don't just hide their oil from the market, they hide it from everything. But even before oil gets refined into gasoline or diesel, it passes through another critical type of storage entirely. Every oil refinery on Earth is surrounded by its own tanks. Crude comes in on one side, refined products leave the other. Crude arrives and gets stored before processing. Refined products come out and get stored before distribution. Tanks on both ends. These tanks are not strategic reserves. They are operating inventory, the buffer that keeps the refinery running smoothly. A refinery that runs out of crude shuts down. A refinery that can't store its finished products stops refining. India, China, the United States, and Saudi Arabia all depend on refinery storage to keep their operations stable every single day. When supply arrives unevenly or demand spikes unexpectedly, refinery storage tanks absorb the pressure on both sides. A refinery without adequate storage is an engine without room to breathe. The tanks are what keep everything moving. So far, everything we've covered belongs to governments or refineries, but not all oil storage does. Commercial terminals are privately operated facilities that hold oil for trade, not national security. The Netherlands, Singapore, the UAE, and China run major commercial hubs where pipelines, ports, rail, and refineries all converge. Commercial terminals don't care who owns the oil or where it came from. They charge for the space and move the product. Oil arrives by sea, gets stored temporarily, and leaves by whatever route the buyer chooses. When commercial terminal capacity tightens, trade slows and prices move. When capacity expands, markets breathe easier. Private storage sets the pace of the global oil market, more quietly than most people ever realize. Now, let's talk about oil that's technically moving, but is also technically being stored at the same time. Pipeline storage. Inside the pipelines of the US, Russia, Canada, and China, enormous volumes of crude are always in transit. That oil in motion is also technically in storage, moving so slowly across continental distances that the line blurs. Dedicated holding tanks at pump stations along the route hold oil while pressure is regulated or destinations are coordinated. Oil can sit inside a segment of pipeline for days while downstream facilities catch up or while markets shift. Pipeline storage is invisible because it isn't thought of as storage. It's thought of as transport, but the line between the two blurs at continental scale. The US, Russia, Canada, and China operate pipeline networks that stretch thousands of miles, and the oil inside them never stops moving. But what about where pipelines don't reach? For that, countries turn to something older and slower: the railway. Rail and mobile tank storage. In places where pipelines don't reach, rail does. Each rail tank car holds roughly 700 barrels. A single train carries hundreds of them, millions of barrels per journey. During pipeline bottlenecks or infrastructure gaps, rail becomes the only way to get oil out of remote fields and into markets. Mobile tanker trucks serve the same function at smaller scale, connecting local oil fields to terminals, refineries, and distribution points. Trucks carry less, cost more per barrel, and are slower, but they go where nothing else goes. Rail and mobile storage are the backup systems of the backup systems. They exist because geography rarely cooperates with infrastructure planning. Japan, South Korea, China, and India import the majority of their oil by sea. Their reserves sit as close to the water as possible. Port-based strategic storage combines rapid unloading access with emergency stockpiling, tank farms, underground caverns, and floating storage all in one coastal hub. If a crisis hits and oil needs to reach the economy fast, having it stored near a port cuts response time dramatically. For countries with no domestic oil and surrounded by potentially hostile geopolitics, the location of their reserves is as important as the size. Where a country keeps its oil says as much about its fears as it does about its infrastructure. Salt caverns, tank farms, floating tankers, rock tunnels, refinery tanks, commercial terminals, pipelines, rail cars, port hubs. Every method. One question answered differently. Countries that control their oil storage control their own stability. The ones that don't are always one crisis away from someone else making their decisions. If this video helped you understand how the world holds its most critical resource, like, subscribe, and share it. See you in the next one.